it's time for Live on Live today. And today I am joined, this Monday, by Christopher Castle, who is the head of Health and Education, the Health and Education section at UNESCO, which of course is headquartered here in Paris. Now, on January the 10th, UNESCO published a revised international technical guidance on sexuality education. Now, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's a very important topic. Now, you were one of the key people in advancing this revised toolkit, if you would say. But first and foremost, before we get into the nitty-gritty, just explain to us what this guidance on sexuality education actually is.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me, David, and it's a pleasure to be here. The guidance was first produced in 2009, and it consisted of a review of the latest evidence, looking at what kind of an impact can we get through comprehensive sexuality education on the lives of children and young people around the world. And we because it's now almost 10 years since then, we thought it was time to update that with a refreshed evidence review, because there have been more recent studies that have been done that tell us what we need to take into account when it comes to supporting ministries of education in particular to implement good quality sexuality education programs. It benefits from that emphasis on scientific evidence. I should also note that UNESCO led the process, but we've worked with several other UN agencies to produce this, including the World Health Organization, UNAIDS, the Joint and Co-Sponsored Program on HIV and AIDS, UNFPA, which is the Family Planning UN agency, UNICEF, UN Women, and the World Health Organization. So
it was very much a UN-wide collaborative approach to actually bring these guidelines, if you will, up to date.
Absolutely, and it needed to be, because basically it's a big issue, it's a big challenge, and I think more and more countries around the world understand that there's a big unmet need when it comes to the sexual and reproductive health needs of children and young people.
And of course there's different vectors that have developed since 2009, where back in 2009 things like Facebook, WhatsApp didn't even exist back then. They were still very much in their infancy. So now people are getting information and of course misinformation, which is one of the main challenges for these guidelines to actually fight against. I mean, can you give us or give our listeners any idea, when you were compiling these new guidelines, what kind of misinformation is actually out there that you are trying to counter?
Sure. Well, children and young people today, as I think everybody's aware, are increasingly exposed to a lot of information through social media, the internet, or even traditional forms of media. And one of the things that we do have very strong data on is that parents in particular and others in the community actually expect that their children and young people have access to accurate information from a trusted source. And that means from teachers in schools.
Sure.
And so the guidance really aims to support ministries of education to train teachers, to revise their curricula, to strengthen their curricula, to support better policies and ultimately education programs, so that children and young people around the world can get access to this information and make, we hope, healthier choices when they start their adult lives.
Now, one quick question. It was something that just that struck me just with the use of the words. It's sexuality education in 2018. When I remember growing up in Ireland in the 1970s and 1980s, it was sex education. Is there a difference in the nuance between sex education and sexuality education now in 2018?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think the use of the term sexuality, or the word sexuality, is intentional in that it puts the emphasis on relationships. One of the things that we learned very early on is that young people, generally speaking, do get access to factual information about how HIV, for example, the virus that causes AIDS, is transmitted, how you can protect against it, how people become pregnant, what you can do to avoid pregnancy, etc. What they often don't get is an opportunity to think through and discuss the skills, attitudes, and behaviors with regards to relationships. And all the evidence was pointing to the fact that one of the reasons why early HIV prevention education and education around pregnancy prevention and other sorts of topics were not as effective, because we weren't situating it in this broader context.
Mm-hmm. Now, indeed, it is something that is very much an ongoing, it's something you have to just kind of get all the information from the ground and actually to be able to make it more accessible. But yet again, on the ground, from one state to another, from one country to another, I mean, maybe today we would say we'll focus on sub-Saharan Africa because that's where a lot of our listeners are. But what about these, how have these dossiers been received in the past? Have they not been at odds with certain, let's just say, national values? I mean, one country's liberty of expression or openness to sexuality education might be a lot more, let's say, one would be much more open to its neighbor across the road. So,
or certainly from one region to another, certainly.
And so how do you get around that?
Yes, that's absolutely right. Well, So first of all, I want to say that the international technical guidance on sexuality education is not prescriptive.
Yeah.
It's not about telling countries what they must do or should do. It's basically a reference. It's a voluntary, non-mandatory set of guidance that is a reference for countries to look at and understand, okay, maybe we're doing some of this already. Maybe we're not introducing it at the right age. One of the things that all of the UN partners that developed this revised guidance and the original in 2009 agreed and understood was that if we want to be effective, we need to introduce educational topics before those issues become an issue. So take the example of menstruation, for example. It's vitally important that girls and young women understand and know about menstruation before it happens to them, which means introducing that in the educational context at an age that happens before they would start their menstruation. And so that's one example. It means we have to start at an early age.
And of course, menstruation is becoming, I mean, demographically, it's been getting younger and younger and younger as the I don't know, what is it, with better nutrition? People are kind of saying, well, maybe it's because of could be even hormones that are put into what the food supply is giving. But some of the statistics about this, is like 2 out of 3 girls have reported having no idea what was happening to their bodies when this actually happened. I mean, literally, that is very surprising for people coming from a Western education, if you will, or from, a privileged education, one can say, in Europe or North America. But how is such a fundamental thing, how are those statistics still at that stage, in your opinion?
That figure you cited is from a relatively recent study from a country in East Africa. And obviously those rates vary. But the reality is many young people, and particularly in the case of menstruation, many young girls don't know what it is before it happens to them. And so it's vitally important also for boys to have a basic level of knowledge about menstruation as well, because
what's happening to their friends in the classroom or whatever.
Exactly. And when they don't, we find that there's often space then for fear and misinformation, bullying and harassment to occur. So it's important for young people to learn in a way that's non-judgmental, that's factually based. And that enables, for example, girls to manage their menstruation with dignity. They need to have access to commodities, and they need to understand what menstruation is before it happens so that they can do that. Schools need to be aware and support girls so that we can reduce, for example, the number of days that they might miss school because they're not comfortable being in school if they don't have access to a private, safe latrine, for example, running water, etc. So that's one example of some of the issues around puberty that's part of comprehensive sexuality education. There are others. So one of the things, for example, in the revised guidance that we've strengthened is an access on gender equality. And we know that it's education programs on sexuality education which are not gender blind, that take into consideration gender and gender dynamics, are 5 times more effective.
So there we go.
It
stands on itself. Now, let's just have a look at something that's a bit more pertinent to France, but also France's role, I suppose, in Africa or in the former colonies. Recently, just before Christmas, President Emmanuel Macron was doing a small 3-nation tour, but he did make a very interesting point in Chad, where he said that France was about to contribute some 15 million euro to facilitate access for education to girls in Niger. Sorry, it was in Niger, excuse me, not Chad. He was meeting with the Chadian President Mamadou Issoufou in Niamey. But he promised 15 million euro. But the main thing that he was really underlining was for girls' education in Niger, for them to stop this cycle, this vicious cycle, where we see some statistics of 7.6 is the median of childbirth births per woman in a country like that, which means that obviously if women are looking after children at such a young age, that they're going to be completely hampered from advancing in their own lifestyle. Is 15 million enough, do you think, from a French president? But also, what do you think of his words? Do you think they should be well received?
I think it's a really smart announcement and a really wise investment on the part of France and other bilateral donor countries who now understand more and more that girls' education is an incredibly important part of advancing overall development goals in general. We know a lot of things about girls' education, one of which is that we need to focus more on the things that prevent them from realizing their right to education. And of course, early and unintended pregnancy is one of those things. And so having access to good quality comprehensive sexuality education is a way for girls to understand and learn about ways to prevent pregnancy and to have healthy relationships when they start their adult lives, including maybe a decision to start having a family at a later age. becoming pregnant before the age of 18 is very detrimental to a woman's health. We know that for sure. We know that when a woman becomes pregnant at an earlier age, it pretty much ends her right to education. The statistics from sub-Saharan Africa suggest that it's 95, 98% of girls who've been pregnant don't continue. And that doesn't help the country in its overall plans for development. We know that if we want to harness the power of girls and young women, then we need to educate them.
Well, we have to leave it at that. My thanks there to Christopher Castle from UNESCO, the head of the Health and Education section. Thank you very much for being on the programme today.
Thank you.